The private room at Elway's smelled like aged wood and money. Someone had ordered the lamb, I could tell from the rosemary in the air, and from the way the servers kept moving toward the far end of the table with covered plates. 80 guests. I'd counted them twice, the way I used to count exits in a room before a negotiation, back when counting things was my job and not just a habit I couldn't shake. Michael stood at the podium near the window. The Denver skyline was behind him, the lights just coming on at 8:15, and he looked exactly the way he'd looked at 32 when he first walked into my office and asked me to put his name on the door. Confident, prepared, certain that the room belonged to him. He smiled at me for the first time that evening. Not when I arrived. Not when Sarah squeezed my arm and whispered that he looked well. Only now, from the podium, with 80 guests between us, did Michael Brennan look at his father and smile. I recognized that smile. I had seen it twice before, once when he closed his first deal without telling me the terms, and once in the hallway outside a conference room where he'd just finished a meeting I hadn't been invited to. It was not a greeting. It was a declaration. I set my water glass down, very carefully. The table was set with linens that cost more than my first truck, and I set the glass down on the linen without a sound, without a ripple, and I folded my hands in my lap. Victoria was seated to his left, slightly behind the podium, the way a person sits when they're not sure whether to stand. She was wearing the blue dress she'd had on at Christmas, and her hands were in her lap too. But differently, her fingers were pressing together at the knuckles, and she kept looking at the side of Michael's face instead of at the room. Victoria Ashford had been married to my son for 6 years. In 6 years. I had never seen her look at him the way she was looking at him now. Like she was waiting for something she didn't know the shape of yet. Michael tapped the microphone once. The room quieted. Someone near the back laughed at something and then stopped. I did not look away from my son. I watched him the way I used to watch a property before I made an offer, not to admire it, but to understand exactly what I was dealing with. He opened his mouth to speak. I had the envelope in my jacket pocket. I had put it there myself, 2 hours before I left the house. I knew what was in it. I knew what I was going to do with it. What I didn't know yet was whether any of it would be enough to save him from himself. I had built Brennan Property Group from a folding table in a rented office on Colfax Avenue. That was 1984, 40 years of reading soil reports at 11 o'clock at night, of driving out to look at a property before anyone else knew it was available, of learning which inspectors were thorough and which ones were not. Sarah used to say I had a talent for real estate. I always told her it wasn't talent. It was attention. Talent is something you're given. Attention is something you choose every single day until it becomes the only way you know how to live. Michael was born in 1989. By the time he was old enough to come with me on weekends, Brennan Property Group had 3 employees and a real office in Cherry Creek. He used to sit in the passenger seat of my truck, a white Ford F-150 that smelled like coffee and sawdust, and ask questions the whole drive, not about money, about the buildings. Why is that one worth more than that one? Why does the parking lot matter? He was 8 years old, and he wanted to understand the logic of it. When he was 14, he helped me evaluate a commercial property in Lakewood, walked the whole thing with me, took notes, and at the end said, quietly, "The roof is the problem, isn't it?" It was. I hadn't told him that. He'd seen it himself. That was the son I thought I was raising. 40 years. Not 40 years of luck. Not 40 years of being in the right place. 40 years of reading soil reports at 11 o'clock at night, of driving out to look at a property before anyone else knew it was available, of learning which inspectors were thorough and which ones were not, of understanding that the difference between a good deal and a catastrophic one was almost always a detail someone hadn't bothered to read. Sarah used to say I had a talent for real estate. I always told her it wasn't talent. It was attention. Talent is something you're given. Attention is something you choose every single day until it becomes the only way you know how to live. Michael was born in 1989, 5 years after I signed the lease on that Colfax office. By the time he was old enough to come with me on weekends, Brennan Property Group had 3 employees and a real office in Cherry Creek. He used to sit in the passenger seat of my truck, a white Ford F-150 that smelled like coffee and sawdust, and ask questions the whole drive, not about money, about the buildings. Why is that one worth more than that one? Why does the parking lot matter? Why do people care which direction the windows face? He was 8 years old, and he wanted to understand the logic of it. I remember thinking, on one of those drives, that he had the right kind of mind for this work. Not the mind that sees what something is worth, the mind that asks why. I took him to job sites on Saturdays. He wore a hard hat that was 2 sizes too large and carried a clipboard he didn't need. And he walked beside me while I talked to the foreman or checked the framing or measured something I'd already measured twice. He learned to read a blueprint before he learned to drive. He knew the difference between load-bearing and non-load-bearing walls at 11 years old. When he was 14, he helped me evaluate a commercial property in Lakewood, walked the whole thing with me, took notes, and at the end said, quietly, "The roof is the problem, isn't it?" It was. I hadn't told him that. He'd seen it himself. That was the son I thought I was raising. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. Looking back now, I can trace it not to a single moment, but to a direction, a slow turning away from one thing toward another. It started, I think, around the time he finished his MBA at Daniels. He came back from Denver with a different posture, not taller, not more confident, exactly more careful about how he stood, how he dressed, which words he chose in a room. He started wearing suits I didn't recognize, Italian labels I couldn't name. He started talking about leverage and portfolio diversification in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with numbers on a screen. That wasn't the problem. People grow. People change their vocabulary. What I noticed, what I couldn't stop noticing, was the way he looked at me when I talked about the work. Not disagreement, not boredom, something more specific than either of those. He would glance at his phone while I was mid-sentence, not to read anything, just to break eye contact. He would nod in a way that meant he had already decided the conversation wasn't worth his full attention. I am not a man who needs to be the most important person in a room. But I had spent 30 years teaching him everything I knew about this business. And the look he gave me now was the look you give a man who is explaining something you already know and no longer find interesting. As if I was an obstacle. That's the only way I can describe it. Not an enemy, not someone he disliked, just something in the way. He was offered the CEO position at Whitmore Capital Ventures 8 months ago. James Whitmore had been circling him for 2 years. I knew that because Whitmore had called me first, 3 years ago, to ask about Michael's capabilities. I had told him the truth that Michael understood real estate development at a level that most people twice his age didn't, that he had good instincts when he trusted them, and that he worked hard. All of that was true when I said it. I believed it when I said it. When Michael got the offer, I found out from Sarah, not from Michael. Sarah had heard from Victoria, who had called her to share the news. I waited 3 days to see if Michael would call. He did not. I called him on the 4th day, and he answered on the 3rd ring and said, in a tone that was pleasant and entirely empty, "Yeah, Dad, I was going to call you. It's been a busy week." I said congratulations. I meant it. He said thank you in a way that made clear the conversation was already over. I asked if he wanted to have dinner to celebrate. He said he'd check his calendar and get back to me. He didn't get back to me. I am not a man who expects gratitude as a performance. I don't need a speech or a formal acknowledgement. But there is a difference between a son who is too busy to call and a son who has decided, somewhere along the way, that the person who built the foundation he is standing on is no longer relevant to the life he is trying to build. Michael had crossed that line, and I think he had crossed it so gradually that he hadn't noticed it happening. I had noticed. I sat in my office on the 12th floor of the Brennan Building, the building I had purchased in 2003 and renovated myself, the building whose lobby still had the original terrazzo floors I had insisted on keeping, and I looked out at the Denver skyline that I had spent 40 years learning to read like a text. I knew which buildings had changed hands twice in 5 years, and why. I knew which developments had been over-leveraged and which ones had been built to last. I had made every mistake worth making in this business, and I had learned from all of them, and I had passed as much of that knowledge as I could to a son who now returned my calls when he had time. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while I was thinking. I drank it anyway. I did not feel sorry for myself. That is not a useful feeling, and I have never found it to be accurate. What I felt, and I am careful with this word, was clear. I could see exactly what was happening to my son, and I could see where it was going. And I understood that the only question left was what I was willing to do about it. The invitation to his promotion dinner arrived in my email 11 days later. Sarah forwarded it to me without comment. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the desk. I called Robert Chen that afternoon. The dinner was held at the Broadmoor's Palladian Room, a venue Michael had chosen himself, which told me something. The Broadmoor was 40 minutes south of Denver, up in Colorado Springs, and it was the kind of place that charged by the impression it made. 12-foot ceilings, chandeliers that cost more than my first truck, a view of Cheyenne Mountain that turned purple at dusk. It was not a modest choice for a promotion dinner. It was a statement. Sarah and I arrived at 6:45. She wore the dark blue dress she'd bought for our anniversary 2 years ago, and she held my arm the way she does when she's not sure what the next hour will bring. I had told her only that I was coming. I had not told her what I was carrying in my jacket pocket, folded along a single crease. We were seated at table 7, not the family table, which was table 2, close to the podium. Table 7 was near the back, between a column and the service corridor. I noted that. I didn't say anything about it. Sarah noticed too, because she looked at the seating card, then at me, and said nothing. That is one of the things I have always respected about her. There were 83 guests by my count. I counted them the way I count everything, not from anxiety, but from habit. 40 years in real estate teaches you to read a room before you speak in it. I recognized 11 faces colleagues from the industry, 2 men from the city planning office, a woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been Michael's mentor at his first firm. Diane was seated at table 4. She caught my eye when we came in and gave me a small nod. I returned it. James Whitmore was at the VIP table 1, centered directly in front of the podium. He was a large man, late 60s, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and learned that stillness communicates more than speech. I had met him twice before, once at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon in 2019 and once when Michael first introduced us, briefly in a parking garage outside the Pinnacle Tower. Whitmore had shaken my hand that day with the polite efficiency of a man who meets 100 people a month and remembers 12 of them. I did not expect him to remember me tonight. Victoria was at the family table. She looked beautiful and uncertain, which was her default expression at events like this, events that Michael organized around himself. She saw us come in and raised her hand in a small wave. Sarah went to her immediately. I stayed near the entrance for a moment, ordered water from a passing server, and watched the room settle. The dinner itself was unremarkable: poached salmon, a risotto that had been sitting too long, speeches from 2 of Michael's colleagues that were generous and brief, a video presentation about the company's Q3 projections that no one in the room cared about except the 3 people from the board. I ate slowly and listened to the table around me discuss the Broncos and the housing market and whether the new light rail extension would reach the tech corridor by 2027. Michael did not come to our table during dinner. He worked the room. I watched him do it, moving from table to table with his hand extended, his smile calibrated, his posture carrying the specific confidence of a man who believes this is his night. He spent 6 minutes at Whitmore's table. He spent 4 at Diane Forsyth's. He did not come to table 7. Sarah touched my hand once, around the time the dessert plates were being cleared. I didn't look at her. I was watching Michael take his position at the podium. He thanked the catering staff. He thanked the board. He thanked his colleagues by name: Henderson, Park, Caldwell, Reyes. He paused for effect after each name, the way people do when they've rehearsed a speech more than they've rehearsed the feelings behind it. The room applauded on cue. Whitmore sat with his hands folded on the table. Then Michael looked up from his notes. He set them aside, a deliberate gesture, the kind that signals a pivot. He said he wanted to say something that wasn't in the prepared remarks. He said he'd been thinking about independence, about what it meant to build something that was truly his own, without interference, without the weight of other people's expectations. The room was quiet in the attentive way rooms go quiet when a speaker changes register. He said he had spent most of his professional life in the shadow of a name that wasn't his achievement. He said he had been managed, second-guessed, and undermined by someone who claimed to want his success but actually wanted his compliance. I set down my water glass. He looked directly at me then, across the length of the Palladian room, past 11 tables and 82 other people. He found my face and held it. He said, "I've spent my entire career being told I owe everything to a man who has been a parasite on my ambition my whole life. Tonight, I'm done. I'm disowning you, Dad, publicly, completely, and without apology." 80 guests gasped. Not all at once, it came in a wave, the way sound moves through a space when the source is unexpected. I heard it travel from the tables nearest the podium backward toward the service corridor, toward table 7. I did not move. Sarah's hand found mine under the table. Her grip was tight, not comforting. Tight, the way you hold someone when you're afraid of what they might do. I turned my hand over and held hers back. Then I shook my head. Once. Very slightly. Michael was still speaking. He said he knew I was sitting there, calculating, looking for my next move. He said I had spent 40 years controlling everything around me and calling it love. He said tonight was the night that ended. The way he looked at me while he said it, that is the part I will not describe in detail, because some things don't need to be made into a story. I will say only that I recognize the expression. I had seen it before, in other rooms, on other faces. It is the expression of a person who has convinced himself completely of something that is not true, and who needs an audience to make the conviction feel real. I said nothing. Victoria had gone very still at table 2. She was looking at her hands. Diane Forsyth, at table 4, was looking at Michael with an expression I could not read from across the room. Whitmore had not moved. His hands were still folded, but his eyes had shifted not to me, not to the room, but to Michael. He was watching Michael the way a man watches something he is reassessing. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the gasps, not the silence, not the way Sarah's fingers tightened around mine. It was the look on Whitmore's face, cold and evaluative, and not at all what Michael had been expecting from the man he was trying to impress. I reached into my jacket pocket. I did not take anything out. I simply rested my hand there, against the folded paper, and waited. I drove home in the left lane the entire way, which I never do. Sarah sat in the passenger seat and didn't speak until we crossed the Spear Boulevard Bridge. And then she said, "You're going to call Robert Chen." It wasn't a question. I told her I was. She nodded and looked back out the window at the city lights on the water. I had known Robert Chen for 11 years. He had come to Brennan Properties straight out of a mid-tier accounting firm in Boulder, carrying a portfolio of clean audits and a reputation for being meticulous to the point of inconvenience. That last quality was the one I had hired him for. Meticulous accountants are inconvenient right up until the moment they are the only thing standing between you and a federal audit. I had told him that on his first day, and he had written it down in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. I don't know if he still kept the notebook. I hadn't seen it in years. I called him at 7:15 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been awake for a while. "Mr. Brennan," he said, just those 2 words. And already something in his voice was careful. Not surprised, careful. The way a man sounds when he has been waiting for a conversation and is not sure he wants it to begin. I told him I needed to talk. I told him it was about the company accounts, specifically the subsidiary accounts under Michael's operational authority. I told him I wasn't asking him to do anything improper. I was asking him to tell me what he had seen. There was a pause. I counted to 4 before he spoke again. "Can we do this in person?" he said. I told him we could. I told him to pick somewhere he was comfortable. He chose a coffee shop on Colfax Avenue, a place called Marguerite's that I had never been to. He said he went there most mornings before work. I said I would be there at 8. He was already at a corner table when I arrived, with his back to the wall and a clear line of sight to the door. He had ordered a black coffee and hadn't touched it. When I sat down across from him, he looked at my face the way a man looks at a document he is trying to authenticate carefully, checking for inconsistencies. I waited. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. He said, "How much do you already know?" I told him I knew enough to be sitting here. I told him I wanted to hear it from him. Robert Chen looked at the table. He was 43 years old and had the kind of stillness that comes from spending a career watching numbers that don't lie even when people do. He said, "I found it 4 months ago. A series of transfers, 11 of them, spread over about 7 months from the Employee Benefit Reserve Fund. The amounts varied. Smallest was $18,000. Largest was $62,000. He looked up. Total came to $340,000. I kept my hands flat on the table. "Where did it go?" I said. "A personal account. The account is registered under a holding company. The name doesn't connect directly to Michael, but the signatory authority does." I cross-referenced it against the formation documents. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He did not hand it to me yet. He held it. He called them temporary loans in the internal notes. That's the only documentation, a line in the transaction memo field. No formal loan agreement, no interest rate, no repayment schedule, no board approval. He paused. No anything. I looked at the paper in his hand. I did not reach for it. "Why didn't you report it?" I said. Robert Chen's jaw tightened. Not in anger, in the particular way a man's jaw tightens when he is about to say something that costs him something, because he told me not to. He said it was a temporary cash flow measure. He said he would have it resolved before the quarterly review. He said he stopped. He set the folded paper on the table between us. He said it would be better for everyone if I kept this internal. The coffee shop had maybe a dozen people in it. A woman near the window was reading something on her phone. 2 men in construction jackets were talking quietly near the counter. No one was paying any attention to the corner table where an old man and a frightened accountant were sitting with a piece of paper between them. "Robert," I said, "are you afraid?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the paper. Then he said, "He's the executive director. If he finds out I talked to you, if he finds out I went outside the chain of command, he'll fire you," I said. Yes. I had worked with men who were afraid before. In 31 years of running a real estate company, I had sat across from contractors who were afraid to tell me a project was behind schedule, from partners who were afraid to tell me a deal had gone sideways, from employees who were afraid to tell me the truth about things that were already done and could not be undone. Fear is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable response to a real threat. What matters is what a person does with it. I said, "Robert, I want you to do something for me. I want you to prepare a complete documentation package, every transaction, every date, every account number, every memo notation. I want originals and copies. I want the holding company formation documents you found. I want everything that exists." He looked at me. "And if Michael finds out?" "I will protect you," I said. "You prepare the documentation. I'll handle everything else." Robert Chen looked at me for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who is deciding whether to trust a bridge that looks solid but crosses a very long drop. I understood the hesitation. I had asked him to put his livelihood on one side of a scale and his conscience on the other, and I was telling him the scale would balance, but I was the one holding it. He said, "You're sure?" I said, "I've been running companies since before you graduated high school. I have never in 31 years allowed a whistleblower to be retaliated against on my watch. That's not a promise. That's a record." He looked at the paper between us for another moment. Then he slid it across the table to me. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a summary page, a single sheet, with the 11 transactions listed in rows. Dates in one column, amounts in the next. Account reference numbers in the third. At the bottom of the page, Robert had written the total in pencil, $340,000. Beneath that, in smaller handwriting, no loan documentation on file, no board authorization, no repayment terms recorded. I folded it back along its original crease and put it in my jacket pocket, next to the other paper I had been carrying since the night before. "How long will it take you to prepare the full package?" I said. "If I work tonight," he said, "I can have it to you by tomorrow morning." I told him that would be fine. I told him to use a personal email address, not his company one. He nodded. He already knew that. I stood up and left two $20 bills on the table for the untouched coffees. Robert Chen was still sitting in the corner with his back to the wall when I walked out. Through the window, as I reached my car, I could see him still sitting there, both hands wrapped around his cup, staring at the middle distance. He had the look of a man who has just made a decision and is not yet sure if it was the right one. I understood that feeling. I had made a few of those myself. The full package arrived in my personal inbox at 6:47 the following morning. Robert had been thorough in the way that only genuinely frightened people are thorough. Every transaction accompanied by a scanned copy of the original transfer authorization. Every memo notation photographed. The holding company formation documents printed in full with the relevant signature lines highlighted in yellow. 11 transfers, 7 months. $340,000 moved through a fund that existed to pay for employee health benefits and retirement contributions. I printed the entire package at the home office I kept in the spare bedroom, the room that used to be Michael's when he was 12 years old and building model aircraft on the desk that was now a filing cabinet. The printer ran for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I counted the pages when it finished. 47 pages. I sat at the desk with the stack of papers in front of me and read through them twice, not because I needed to read them twice, because I wanted to understand exactly what I was looking at, not as a father, but as a man who had spent 31 years reading documents that told the truth about people's choices. What I understood, reading those 47 pages, was this Michael had not been careful. He had been sloppy in the particular way that people are sloppy when they believe no one is watching them, when they believe the position they hold is protection enough, when they confuse authority with impunity. The transfers were spread across 7 months, which suggested planning. But the documentation, or rather the absence of it, suggested arrogance. A man who was genuinely careful would have created paper cover, a promissory note, even a fraudulent one, an internal memo with a plausible explanation. Something. Michael had left nothing but the transaction memos, and those memos said temporary loan in 3 words that had no legal weight behind them. He had not been trying to hide it from everyone. He had been trying to hide it from people who were looking. The distinction matters. It meant he had assessed the risk and concluded that no one with authority to act would ever look. And for 7 months, he had been right. He had not counted on Robert Chen's particular brand of inconvenient meticulousness, and he had not counted on me. I put the 47 pages into a manila envelope and wrote Robert Chen's name on the outside in pencil, then crossed it out and left it blank. I set the envelope on the corner of the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name was Linda Forsythe, not the same Forsythe who had been at table 4 the night before, though I had thought of that coincidence more than once. Linda had handled my corporate legal work for 16 years and had the particular quality I valued most in attorneys. She did not tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what was true. I told her I had documentation of a series of unauthorized transfers from a company benefit fund, totaling $340,000, with no supporting loan agreement, no board authorization, and no repayment structure. I told her the transfers had been made by an executive with signatory authority who had represented them internally as temporary loans. I told her I needed to know what I was holding. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas, is this who I think it is?" I told her it was. She said, "Send me the package, all of it. I'll review it today." I told her I would. I also told her I needed to know one more thing, not about prosecution, not about civil liability, not about the company's exposure. I needed to know whether what I was holding was enough to stop something before it went further than it already had. She said, "Send me the package first, then we'll talk about what it's enough for." I sent it at 8:15. By 10:40, she called back. She spoke for 6 minutes. I did not interrupt her. When she finished, I thanked her and set the phone down on the desk in the room that used to be Michael's. Outside the window, the front range was clear and very far away, the way it looks in November when the air has no humidity in it and the mountains seem closer than they are. Michael had grown up in this house looking at those mountains every morning. I had watched him look at them. I had thought, when he was young, that he understood something about distance, that things that seem far away are not always as far as they appear, and that the reverse is also true. I looked at the envelope on the corner of the desk. 47 pages, $340,000, 7 months of choices, all of them documented, none of them recoverable by anything except what happened next. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. What I felt, sitting in that room with the mountains visible through the window and the envelope on the desk, was something closer to grief, the specific grief of a man who has read a document that tells him exactly how far his son has traveled from the person he raised him to be. And underneath that grief, something else, a clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping the numbers are wrong and accept that they are exactly what they say. I picked up the envelope. I put it in my briefcase next to the folded paper from the night before. Then I went downstairs to make coffee because there was still work to do, and I have never been able to do it without coffee, and some things do not change regardless of what the documents say. I called Hollis Vane's office at 7:43 in the morning. His assistant, a woman named Diane who had been answering that phone for at least 12 years, picked up on the second ring. I told her I needed to see Hollis today. She asked if 2 o'clock would work. I told her it would. Hollis Vane had been my attorney since I was 52 years old, when I was trying to close a commercial acquisition on a property in Lodo that the seller's attorney was doing his level best to complicate. Hollis had been the one who found the easement issue that unraveled the seller's position entirely. After that, I kept him. He was the kind of attorney who read everything twice and said very little until he was certain, which meant that when he did speak, you listened. In 15 years, I had never once heard him say something he later had to walk back. His office was on the 16th floor of a building on 17th Street, 3 blocks from the Brown Palace. I'd been there enough times that the elevator operator, an older man named Frank, who had worked that building for 20 years, recognized me without my having to say anything. He nodded when I stepped in. I nodded back. Neither of us spoke on the way up. Diane brought coffee without being asked. I set my briefcase on the chair beside me and waited. The office smelled like paper and the particular dry warmth of a building that runs its heat higher than necessary. Outside the window, the mountains were clear. It had not snowed in 11 days. Hollis came in at 2:04. He was 61, thin, with the kind of deliberate posture that comes from decades of sitting across from people who are trying to read something in your face. He shook my hand, sat down, and looked at the briefcase. I opened it and set the envelope on his desk. Then I set Robert's summary beside it, the 4 pages Robert had printed, annotated in pencil, initialed at the bottom of each page. I told Hollis to read it before I said anything. He nodded and picked up the first page. He read without expression. That was the thing about Hollis. He had trained himself out of the involuntary reactions that most people don't even notice they're having. No eyebrow movement, no shift in posture, no pause in the turning of pages. He read all 4 pages of Robert's summary, then opened the envelope and read through the transaction records themselves. That took longer. At one point, he went back to the second page of Robert's summary and read a specific section again. Then he set everything down, aligned the edges of the papers, and looked at me. He said, "Thomas, this is embezzlement." I told him I knew. He said, "Michael has made 23 unauthorized transfers over 14 months. The total is $340,000. The transfers were structured to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic flagging, which means this wasn't impulsive. Someone thought about how to do it without being caught." He paused. "Michael could be prosecuted, depending on how the DA's office wants to handle it. We're looking at potential felony charges, significant fines, and real prison exposure. Not theoretical exposure. Real." I picked up my coffee cup. It was still warm. I held it without drinking. Hollis continued, "Now, there are options. The money hasn't left the country. The transfers went to accounts. We can trace Robert's notes, indicate 2 of them are registered to shell entities, but shells can be pierced. If you want, we can approach this quietly. I can reach out to the company's general counsel, present the documentation, and negotiate a restitution arrangement. Michael repays the funds. steps back from his role, and the company agrees not to pursue criminal referral. It's messy, but it's survivable. I asked him the question I had been turning over since the morning I opened the envelope. I said, "If I do nothing, if I walk out of here and don't use any of this, how long before someone else finds it?" Hollis didn't hesitate. He said, "The independent auditors." Whitmore's board brought in an external audit firm 6 weeks ago, standard practice when a new executive takes over a position with this level of financial authority. They'll examine the books. Given what Robert found in 4 pages, the auditors will find it in their first pass. He looked at me directly. 3 months. Thomas, maybe less. When that happens, Michael won't have any warning. The referral goes straight to the DA's office, and the first thing Michael will know about it is when someone calls his attorney. The room was very quiet. On the street 16 floors below, a truck moved through an intersection. I watched it for a moment. 3 months. I had been thinking in terms of years, the slow accumulation of distance between a father and a son, the gradual cooling of something that had once been warm. But this was not that kind of timeline. This was a countdown that was already running, and Michael had no idea the clock existed. I thought about the morning I taught him to drive. He was 16, and we were in the parking lot of a shopping center on a Sunday, and he was so certain he already knew how to do it that he barely listened to anything I said. He stalled the car 3 times before he admitted he might need to hear the explanation again. That was Michael, the certainty first, the listening second, always in that order. I had watched that pattern for 41 years, and I had never found a way to reverse it. The difference was that stalling a car in an empty parking lot cost nothing. What he had done over the past 14 months was going to cost him everything he had spent the last decade building if the auditors found it before anyone else did. Hollis picked up his pen and set it down again without writing anything. He said, "There's another option. You have the documentation. You have Robert's analysis, which is clean and credible. Robert Chen has been in this industry long enough that his name on those annotations carries weight. You could use what you have to force a conversation that Michael is not going to want to have. Bring this to James Whitmore directly. Whitmore has the authority to handle this internally. He can require restitution, require Michael to step back, and close the file before the auditors ever get to it. If Whitmore handles it that way, the criminal exposure disappears. The money goes back. Michael's career takes a serious hit, but he doesn't face prosecution." I said, "And if Michael refuses to cooperate?" Hollis said, "Then it goes the other way. But Whitmore is a businessman. He would rather recover $340,000 quietly than spend 18 months in depositions and have the whole thing reported in the Denver Business Journal." He set his hands flat on the desk. "The leverage is real, Thomas. What you're holding is enough to make Whitmore move, and it's enough to make Michael understand that the alternative is something he cannot survive professionally or legally." I looked at the papers on his desk. Robert's handwriting in the margins small, precise, the handwriting of a man who has spent 30 years making sure the numbers are right. The transaction dates running down the left column of the first page. 14 months of decisions that Michael had made believing no one was paying attention. Hollis said, "The choice is yours. You can protect him from prosecution, or you can let the auditors find it and let the process run. But I want you to understand clearly, if you do nothing, I don't think the outcome is survivable for him. Not in any way that matters." I had one chance to save him. That was the thing I kept arriving at. No matter which direction I approached it from, not one chance to punish him, not one chance to prove I had been right about something. One chance to put myself between my son and the thing he had built in the dark. Before the auditors walked in with their flashlights and the whole structure came down with him inside it. I did not want to be in Hollis's office. I wanted to be in a different version of this year, one where Michael had called me when he first got into financial pressure, whatever the pressure was, because there was always a reason, always something underneath the thing that looks like greed, and I had been the person he called instead of the person he hid from. I had been available. I had told him I was available, but available and trusted are not the same thing, and somewhere in the last few years, I had become the second category without knowing it. That was the part I sat with while Hollis waited, not the $340,000. not the 14 months. The fact that my son had been in enough trouble to do something this dangerous, and the person he had not called was me. Hollis did not rush me. He understood, I think, that there are decisions that require the space to be made properly, and that pushing a man toward them faster than he is ready to move produces the wrong answer. I picked up Robert's summary and looked at the bottom of the last page, where Robert had written his initials in the same careful hand he used for everything. Robert had been with me for 9 years. He had found this because he was good at his job and because the numbers had bothered him enough to keep looking. He had not had to bring it to me. He had chosen to. I thought about what it meant that Robert had come to me instead of going directly to Whitmore's board. He had come to me first. That was its own kind of trust, and I was not going to waste it. I told Hollis I wanted the documentation organized into a single file, clean, dated, with Robert's summary at the front and the transaction records behind it in chronological order. I told him I wanted a one-page cover memo that stated the facts without interpretation, the kind of document that speaks for itself without needing anyone to explain it. Hollis picked up his pen. He said, "When do you need it?" I told him I needed it by Friday. The promotion dinner was Saturday evening. He wrote that down. Then he looked up and said, "Thomas, what are you going to do with it?" I told him I was going to give Michael one opportunity to understand what was coming, not in private, where he could dismiss it the way he had been dismissing things for the past 2 years, in front of the one person whose opinion could still change the outcome. I was going to make sure James Whitmore knew exactly what his new executive director had been doing, and I was going to do it in a way that gave Michael the choice he had never given himself the choice to stop before the auditors made the choice for him. Hollis looked at me for a moment. He said, "That's not what most fathers would do." I told him I wasn't trying to be most fathers. He nodded and began writing. I finished my coffee, which had gone cold while we talked. I drank it anyway. Outside the window, the mountains were still there, the same as they had been when I walked in, indifferent to everything that had just been decided in this room. I have always found that studying the way the mountains do not adjust themselves to accommodate whatever is happening at ground level. They simply remain. 4 days before the dinner, I drove to the Whitmore Capital offices on 17th Street to drop off a revised easement analysis for a property Michael had asked me to review 3 weeks earlier, one of the last times he had asked me for anything. I had not told him I was coming. His assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had the careful politeness of someone navigating a difficult office, looked slightly uncomfortable when I gave her my name. She said Michael was in a meeting. I told her I would leave the folder with her. I was still standing at her desk when the conference room door opened. Michael came out first, followed by 2 men I didn't recognize, and James Whitmore, who I had not expected to see there. Michael saw me immediately. Something moved across his face, not surprise, something more controlled than that, and then he smiled, the way he had been smiling at me for the past 2 years, pleasantly, and from a great distance. One of the men beside him said something about the Larimer Street parcel. Michael turned to answer, and as he turned, he said, without looking back at me, "Dad, this isn't a good time. Priya can take whatever you brought." The other man glanced at me. Whitmore glanced at me. Neither of them said anything. "Dad, this isn't your call anymore," Michael said, still not looking at me. "We've got it handled." Priya was looking at her desk. I set the folder on the counter beside her. I said, "Of course. Sorry to interrupt." I said it to the room. Not to Michael specifically, because Michael had already turned back to his colleagues. I walked to the elevator. Frank was not working that building. A different operator brought me down without speaking. In the lobby, I stopped for a moment near the revolving door and looked at the folder I had just left upstairs. 2 weeks of work, a detailed analysis that would save them a significant easement dispute if anyone bothered to read it. I pushed through the door and walked to my car. That evening, I called Hollis and told him to have everything ready by Friday. I picked up my briefcase, shook Hollis's hand, and told Diane on the way out that she made excellent coffee. She told me I was welcome back any time. Frank brought the elevator without being called. On the way down, he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Brennan." I told him it was getting there. I drove back to the office on Spear Boulevard and sat at my desk for 40 minutes without turning on my computer. The afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and moved slowly across the floor the way it does in late autumn, when the sun is lower and the shadows are longer and everything takes on a quality of being almost finished. I watched it move. I did not count anything. I did not need to. Friday was 4 days away. I had work to do before then, and I have always been better at working than waiting. I opened my computer and started going through the quarterly projections for the Thornton development. The numbers were clean. Someone had done their job correctly. I made a note to tell them so in the morning. The room at the Meridian Club had a particular quality of sound when it went quiet. Not silence exactly, but a kind of held breath, the way a concert hall sounds in the 2 seconds between the last note and the applause. I had been in this room twice before, once for my wife's 45th birthday, and once for the groundbreaking dinner when we first started Brennan Properties 31 years ago. Both times, the room had been warm. Tonight, it was not warm. Michael was still standing at the podium. He had finished speaking perhaps 15 seconds ago, but he hadn't moved. He was looking out at the room the way a man looks at a crowd when he expects something approval. Confirmation. The sound of his own certainty reflected back at him. A few people at the tables near the front began to clap. It was the careful kind of applause, the kind that fills space without committing to anything. I recognized it. I had heard it at planning commission meetings when a proposal wasn't quite right, but no one wanted to say so yet. Sarah's hand found mine under the table. She pressed it once, hard, the way she does when she wants me to know she is there without saying anything out loud. I looked at her. She was watching Michael, and her face was doing the thing it does when she is working very hard to hold it still. I turned my hand over and held hers for a moment. Then I stood up. She looked at me immediately. Her grip tightened. I shook my head one small, deliberate motion, and she let go. I buttoned my jacket. It was a habit from the years when I wore a suit every day to job sites and city council meetings, when the act of buttoning meant you were ready for whatever came next. I picked up the folded envelope from my inside pocket, the one I had prepared Thursday evening at my desk on Larimer Boulevard. After the light had moved across the floor and the quarterly projections were done, I held it flat against my chest and walked toward the VIP section. The room was arranged in a series of concentric arcs around the podium, with the long table for Whitmore and the board members positioned to the left and slightly elevated on a low platform, a detail the Meridian Club always included for events of this kind, so that the principals could see and be seen. I had attended enough of these dinners over 30 years to know the geometry of them by heart. I walked along the outside edge of the room, not through the center, not in a straight line toward Michael. I walked the way I always walk when I am going somewhere specific and do not want anyone to notice until I am already there. James Whitmore was sitting at the end of the long table nearest the window. He was 63 years old, and he had been chairman of the board at Whitmore Capital Group for 11 years. I had met him 7 times in the past 2 decades, twice at industry conferences, once at a charity auction for Denver Children's Hospital, and 4 times at events connected to Michael's career. He was the kind of man who remembered names and made you feel that remembering your name had cost him something, which made you feel important. He was looking at his water glass when I reached the table. I pulled out the chair to his immediate left and sat down, not across from him, beside him, close enough that I could speak without raising my voice above the ambient sound of the room. He looked up. His expression was courteous and slightly puzzled. He said, "Thomas." I leaned close and said, quietly, "Your new executive director has been stealing from his employees for 14 months. The documentation is in this envelope." I set the envelope on the table between us and sat back. Whitmore did not speak. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at me. I watched his face the way I used to watch structural reports when I was looking for the number that didn't match, not reading for the general picture, but reading for the specific detail that changes what everything else means. His face changed the way those reports changed, not all at once, one thing at a time. He picked up the envelope and opened it. He unfolded the first page, the summary sheet that Robert had prepared. 3 columns, clean and specific, with the dates and amounts and account numbers in sequence. He read it the way people read things they are hoping will turn out to say something different than they think it says. He read it twice. Then he looked up toward the podium where Michael was still standing, answering a question from someone in the second row, smiling the way he had been smiling all evening. Whitmore set the page down. He said, very quietly, "You have all of this documented." I said, "Every transaction. My lawyer has been working with a forensic accountant since the first week of November." He said, "Robert Chen found this." It was not a question, but I answered it. "Robert brought it to me 6 weeks ago. He didn't know what to do with it. I told him to keep it between us until I had time to verify everything properly." Whitmore looked at the second page. His jaw moved once, a small tightening, and then went still. He was the kind of man who had learned, over a long career, not to let his face do too much. But there are things that get through regardless. I had seen that expression before, not anger exactly, but the specific quality of a man recalibrating, rapidly, everything he thought he knew about a situation. He folded the pages back into the envelope. He set it on the table with both hands flat on top of it, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't move. Then he stood up. He looked up. His expression was courteous and slightly puzzled. He said, "Thomas." I said, "James, I apologize for interrupting your evening." I kept my voice level. I had been keeping my voice level for 67 years, and I was good at it. "I need to tell you something before this dinner goes any further." He set down his water glass. He had the particular quality of attention that comes from decades of hearing things people don't want to say in public, a stillness, a slight forward orientation. He said, "All right." I placed the envelope on the table between us. I did not open it yet. Michael transferred $340,000 from the Employee Benefit Fund into a personal account. The transfers happened in 3 separate transactions between August and October of this year. The documentation is in that envelope: bank records, internal transfer authorizations, the account information. I paused for exactly one breath. My lawyer has the originals. What you're holding is a certified copy. Whitmore did not speak. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at me. I watched his face the way I used to watch structural reports when I was looking for the number that didn't match, not reading for the general picture, but reading for the specific detail that changes what everything else means. His face changed the way those reports changed. Not all at once. One thing at a time. He picked up the envelope. I said, "I don't want Michael prosecuted. I want you to know the truth before he makes any further decisions on behalf of your firm. That's the only reason I'm here." Whitmore opened the envelope. He unfolded the first page, the summary sheet that Robert had prepared. 3 columns, clean and specific, with the dates and amounts and account numbers in sequence. He read it the way people read things they are hoping will turn out to say something different than they think it says. He read it twice. Then he looked up toward the podium where Michael was still standing, answering a question from someone in the second row, smiling the way he had been smiling all evening. Whitmore set the page down. He said, very quietly, "You have all of this documented." I said, "Every transaction. My lawyer has been working with a forensic accountant since the first week of November." He said, "Robert Chen found this." It was not a question, but I answered it. "Robert brought it to me 6 weeks ago. He didn't know what to do with it. I told him to keep it between us until I had time to verify everything properly." Whitmore looked at the second page. His jaw moved once, a small tightening, and then went still. He was the kind of man who had learned, over a long career, not to let his face do too much. But there are things that get through regardless. I had seen that expression before. Not anger exactly, but the specific quality of a man recalibrating, rapidly, everything he thought he knew about a situation. He folded the pages back into the envelope. He set it on the table with both hands flat on top of it, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't move. Then he stood up. The table went quiet. First, the 4 other board members who had been talking among themselves registered the movement and stopped. Then the nearest tables. It moved outward from the VIP section like a ripple, the way quiet always moves in a room full of people who are paying attention without admitting it. By the time Whitmore had stepped down from the platform and crossed the 12 feet of open floor to the podium, perhaps 40 or 50 people had already turned to watch. By the time he reached Michael, the number was closer to 80. Michael saw him coming. He stopped mid-sentence. He had been answering a question about Q1 projections and turned toward Whitmore with the easy confidence of a man who expects to be approached with congratulations. He extended his hand. Whitmore did not take it. He said, "Michael." His voice carried, even though he had not raised it. The room was quiet enough for that. "We need to talk. Right now. Not here." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence after Michael's speech. That silence had been uncomfortable and provisional. This one was complete. Michael's hand was still extended. He lowered it slowly. He looked at Whitmore, and I watched his expression go through several things in the space of about 4 seconds: confusion first, then a reaching for the right social response, then something else. He looked past Whitmore toward the VIP table. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at me. I did not look away. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked down at the table in front of me. At nothing in particular, the way you look when you have said what you needed to say, and there is nothing left to add. When I looked up again, Victoria was standing near the edge of the room. She had moved from her seat at the family table sometime in the last 2 minutes. I hadn't seen her move, but she was there now, near the wall, with her arms at her sides and her evening bag held in both hands in front of her. She was watching Michael. Her face was not the face of a woman who was shocked. It was the face of a woman who had been half expecting something and had just learned what it was. There is a difference between those two expressions, and I know it well enough to read it across a room. Michael turned back to Whitmore. He said something I was too far away to hear the words, but I could see the shape of them. The slight upward inflection at the end that turns a statement into a question. Whitmore shook his head. One motion, very small, very final. He put his hand briefly on Michael's shoulder, not warmly, but in the way that means move, and gestured toward the hallway to the left of the podium. Michael went. He didn't look back at the room. He walked the way a man walks when he knows everyone is watching and has decided that his only option is to keep moving forward and deal with what comes next in private. I recognized that walk too. I had seen it in city council chambers and bankruptcy hearings and on job sites when a structural inspection had just failed. It was the walk of a man who was still calculating. The room stayed quiet for another several seconds after they left. Then, slowly, the sound came back, not normal conversation, but the particular low-register murmur of a room full of people processing something they hadn't expected and weren't sure yet how to discuss. I heard the word Michael from 3 different directions. I heard someone at the nearest table say, very quietly, "What just happened?" I heard no answer. Sarah was beside me. I hadn't heard her cross the room, but she was there, her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. I looked at her face, and I saw that she had been crying, very slightly, the kind of crying that happens in the eyes before it reaches anywhere else. I put my hand over hers. At the VIP table, 2 of the board members were looking at the envelope Whitmore had left behind. Neither of them touched it. One of them, a woman named Diane Cho, who I knew slightly from a land use conference 3 years ago, looked up and met my eyes for a moment. She looked away first. The room was beginning to reassemble itself around the absence of the 2 men who had just left it. Waitstaff moved between the tables. Someone near the bar laughed at something, then stopped. The chandelier above the center of the room threw the same light it had been throwing all evening, steady and indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. Victoria was beside me before I reached my chair. I had not seen her cross the room. One moment she was near the wall with her evening bag held in both hands. And then she was there close, her voice low enough that no one at the nearest table could have heard her. She said, "Thomas," just my name. The way she said it, careful, like she was testing the weight of it. I looked at her. Her mascara was intact, but her eyes were doing the work that the rest of her face was not. She was 29 years old, and she had been married to my son for 6 years, and she was looking at me the way a person looks when they have been carrying a question for a long time and have finally decided to ask it. "I didn't know what he did," she said. "With the money. I didn't know the specifics." She stopped. Her fingers pressed together around the clasp of her bag. But I knew something was wrong. 3 months ago, maybe 4. The way he talked about the accounts. The way he changed the subject when I asked about work. She looked down for a moment. I told myself it was stress, that he was managing something difficult and didn't want to worry me. She looked back up. I think I wanted to believe that. I did not say anything. I let her finish. I should have asked harder, she said. I know that. The room was still reassembling itself around the absence of the two men who had just left it. A waiter moved past us with a tray. Someone near the bar said something and laughed and then went quiet. Victoria, I said, go home tonight. Get some sleep. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. She nodded once, tightly, the way people nod when they are trying not to cry in a room full of people. Then she turned and walked back toward the family table, where her coat was still draped over the back of her chair. I sat back down. My coffee was on the table where I had left it. It was cold. I drank it anyway. Sarah was sitting where I had left her. She had not moved from her chair, but her posture had changed, her shoulders lower, her hands folded on the table in front of her, the way she sat when she had been waiting and was finally done waiting. When I sat down beside her, she didn't say anything. She put her arm around me and held it there. I looked at my wine glass. I had poured it at the beginning of the evening and never touched it. The surface was completely still. Around us, the room found its voice again, not all at once in pieces. A question murmured at the table to our left, a chair scraping back, someone near the window asking what had happened, and someone else explaining in a low, careful tone. Waitstaff moved through the room with the particular efficiency of people who had been trained to be invisible and were now grateful for something to do. A young man in a white jacket began clearing the appetizer plates from the table where Michael had been sitting. He worked quickly and did not look up. Diane Cho, 2 tables over, caught my eye a second time. This time she held it for a moment. She gave a very small nod. Not approval, not sympathy, just acknowledgement, and then turned back to the man beside her. I didn't stay for dessert. Neither did Sarah. We said goodnight to the 2 people nearest the door, who spoke to us, a couple I knew from a zoning board meeting in 2019, whose names I remembered, but whose faces I was having trouble placing in that moment. And then we were outside, and the November air was cold and immediate and clean. Sarah held my arm on the way to the car. She didn't ask me anything until we were on the highway heading back toward the city, the downtown lights beginning to show in the distance. Did you know it would go like that? She said. No, I said. I knew what I had. I didn't know what he would do with it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, he looked so young when Whitmore walked him out. I kept my eyes on the road. He is young, I said. My phone rang at 11:47. James Whitmore. I pulled over on a surface street 2 blocks from our building and answered it. His voice was steady, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it, a tiredness or a reluctance. He said, Michael will resign. Effective Monday. We'll handle the public statement internally. The board will meet Thursday. He paused. I wanted to ask you, what do you want me to do with the rest of it? The financial matter. I had thought about this answer for longer than Whitmore knew. I had thought about it in Robert Chen's office when Robert slid the second spreadsheet across the desk and waited for me to react. I had thought about it on the drive home from my attorney's office last Tuesday, and again at 3 in the morning, 2 days before the dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I hadn't drunk. I want you to give him a way to fix it, I said. He can return the money on a structured timeline. He can meet with the affected staff personally and apologize. He can agree to a 5-year prohibition from any executive role with the company. I paused. He's 34 years old, James. He made a serious mistake. That doesn't have to be the only thing he ever is. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. I heard him exhale. That's more generous than most people would be, he said. I'm not most people, I said. He's my son. There was another pause. All right, Whitmore said. I'll have counsel draw up the agreement. It'll need his signature by end of week. He'll sign it, I said. I didn't actually know that, but I said it anyway. The next morning, Michael called at 8:22. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had made 20 minutes earlier and not yet touched. Sarah was still asleep. The apartment was very quiet. I let it ring twice before I answered. He didn't say hello. He said, "I know what you did last night." His voice was flat, not angry, not broken, just flat, the way a voice sounds when it has been up all night and has run out of the energy required to perform any particular emotion. I didn't say anything. "I don't know what to say," he said. I had thought about this moment too. Not the specific words, but the shape of it, the silence on the other end, the distance that would be in his voice, the particular quality of a conversation between two people who love each other and have just done serious damage to each other and are not yet sure what is left. "You don't have to say anything right now," I said. "I know you don't want to see me. Not today. Maybe not for a while. That's all right." He didn't respond. "Michael," I said, "I love you. That's why I did it. Not to take something from you, to keep you from losing everything on your own." The line was quiet for a long time. I counted the seconds without meaning to the way I used to count ceiling tiles in difficult meetings, something to hold on to when everything else was moving too fast. I counted to 11. He hung up. I set the phone down on the table. The coffee in front of me had a faint curl of steam still rising from it, thin and almost invisible in the morning light coming through the window over the sink. I watched it until it stopped. Sarah came in at 9. She was wearing the gray cardigan she'd had since before we moved into this apartment, the one with the fraying left cuff she had never gotten around to fixing. She looked at me, then at the phone on the table, then back at me. She didn't ask. She sat down in the chair across from mine and reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We didn't speak. The coffee went cold. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly down the street below. Someone in the building above us was walking from one room to another in shoes that needed new soles. The radiator in the corner of the kitchen made the small clicking sound it made every morning when the heat came on. Michael signed Whitmore's agreement on Friday. Robert Chen called to tell me, professionally and without editorial comment, the way Robert always delivered information he knew carried weight. The repayment schedule was set at 18 months. The staff meetings would begin the following week. His resignation was announced in an internal memo on Monday morning. Whitmore's communications team wrote it carefully, no specifics, no accusations. The language of a mutual decision made for professional reasons. But people who work in offices know the difference between a departure and a removal. By Tuesday, Diane Forsyth had called Sarah to ask if we were all right. By Wednesday, 2 of Michael's former colleagues had quietly reached out to Robert Chen to ask what had actually happened. Robert told them he couldn't discuss it. That, in itself, was an answer. The first repayment transfer came through on the 14th of December, $41,000, the first installment of 18. Robert confirmed it by email. One line, no commentary. I printed the email and put it in the folder with the rest of the documentation. Not as a record of victory, as a record of a debt being repaid, which is a different thing entirely. I heard, through Hollis, that Michael had taken a position at a small property management firm in Boulder, not development, not executive work, something quieter. Hollis mentioned it the way he mentioned things he thought I should know, but hadn't been asked about directly. I thanked him and did not ask for details. I did not call Michael to tell him I was glad. I did not call him at all that week. 3 weeks later, a card arrived in the mail, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting, the same slightly cramped print he had used since grade school, the lowercase letters too small and the capitals too large. The card had a picture of the mountains on the front. Inside, he had written 4 words, "I'm not ready yet." I set the card on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light would hit it. Sarah saw it there that evening and didn't say anything. She just touched the corner of it with 2 fingers as she passed. That was enough. If you've ever waited for 4 words from someone you raised and felt the whole weight of them land in the silence between what they said and what they meant, you already understand why some things don't need an answer. I'll keep these stories as long as there are people who know that kind of quiet. I'll be here